Today I want to showcase some of the boxes or some of the methodologies that I like to use to create just like a generalist box, a box that I can take to any local creek in the Texas Hill Country to fish for bass, sunfish, carp, Rio Grande cichlids. It's just some patterns that I like to use that have caught a multitude of species and are pretty simple to tie. If anything, I hope you guys gain some knowledge just from the different patterns that I like to use. And if you guys don't mind, in the comments, share some patterns that you like to use or the patterns that work well for you. I know a lot of the times in the winter, I'm usually daydreaming about the fish that I'm going to catch in the summer. And tying these flies helps me stay connected to the hobby that I really do enjoy. And when I'm not out fishing, you know, it's a lot easier to sit down and tie some flies and think about those trips that you're going to take in the spring and summer. So without further ado, to help, I guess, separate and streamline this video, we'll break down the flies in the fly box by 3 categories, either by dry flies or flies that float, nymphs or flies that sink, and streamers, basically flies that look like small bait fish. So to start talking about the dry flies section first, we're going to start off with the size 14 foam beetle. I really do enjoy fishing this pattern by itself. Very rarely I'll add a dropper to this. I mainly just fish the beetle by itself, and when I'm going after small panfish, even sometimes some small bass will come up and pick it up, but I think it's a very essential pattern in the box, and it's also a pretty easy one to tie for beginners. Moving up in size, I have a size 10 Chernobyl ant pattern. So this is a very key pattern in my box. I definitely fish the dry dropper rig a lot, and this is my standard dry fly that I go with. It's big enough that bass will come up and take it, and also, you know, small enough to where sunfish can come pick at it as well. It's really, really hard to sink this fly. So my favorite combo though is having the Chernobyl ant as a dry, and for my dropper I'll have a bully bluegill. And the rubber legs on both of those patterns entice so many bass and sunfish. So definitely my go-to, but we'll get to the bully bluegill pattern a little bit later. For a strict grasshopper hopper imitation, I've got the Lano bug in here. It's tied by Kevin Hutchison originally, and he's got some pretty good videos of how to tie this pattern. I'll go ahead and link some of that in the description box below. That rounds out the dry fly portion of the box. So now we're going to move on to the nymph patterns. So starting off, the bully bluegill. So this pattern was intended for panfish because of the rubber legs that really do entice strikes from those fish, and you can tie them up in a variety of colors. I've got brown, chartreuse, and a dark olive. I really do like this pattern. It's one of my favorite nymph patterns. I've used it in ponds before, and it has been really good for me in catching small sunfish. Bass will sometimes take them, but it's mainly a good bluegill panfish pattern, and definitely an essential in the box. You definitely need something with rubber legs. So moving on is the Rio Getter that is tied by Matt Bennett, and he's got a pretty good video of how to tie this pattern as well. It is specifically to target those picky Rio Grande cichlids, but I've had so many other species come up and take this fly. Sunfish, bass, even carp in bigger sizes will take this. I've even caught a catfish on this pattern before. It is definitely a staple in a lot of Central Texas fly fishers box, and of course, not unheard of. You probably already know it. Definitely an essential for a good generalist box. I've got a few tied here with bead chain eyes and then the lead Dumbo eyes if I want to sink it a little bit deeper. I usually use the bead chain Rio Getter as a dropper for my Chernobyl ant. Pretty good combo for me as well. So the Rio Getter, pretty much all you got to say. Now, this is another very important pattern for that Matt Bennett ties as well. It is the carpet bomb, and it is mainly to target carp, but again, you can catch bass on this thing. You can catch drum, sunfish in smaller sizes, catfish. If you are going to fish Central Texas with one fly, this would probably be it. You can catch so many things with this. It is definitely meant to be at the bottom. It is super buggy, and it's actually pretty easy to tie, and it's pretty good introduction into tying dubbing loops. So for a beginner, it may be a little bit more on the intermediate side, but definitely a pattern that's pretty good. You learn a lot of good techniques tying this pattern. definitely recommend it. It is a damsel fly imitation, so super important for the box and probably one of my favorite flies. Moving on, I've got a hare's ear nymph on a jig hook, and you may be thinking, you know, isn't that a trout pattern? But I find that it is pretty effective not only on sunfish, but Rio Grande cichlids will even come and pick this up, and even some small bass as well. They're not too picky. In the winter, it's actually a really good pattern for me when the fish aren't biting too much. Usually a good size 10 hare's ear will just pick them right out of the water. It's pretty easy to tie, and it's also a good introduction to trout flies. There's a lot of videos on how to tie hare's ears, and really it's up to you, customizable, pretty good beginner pattern as well. So good hare's ear nymph, I find is pretty essential in the box, and so I've included it here. I also have a wet fly nymph. This would also be, you know, like a trout, considered a trout fly, but I also find that it's super effective in the winter or when the water temperatures start dropping. Most of the strikes you're going to get from fish are going to be from underneath in the water column. And fishing this wet fly entices a lot of bass and sunfish because I move it slow down at the bottom. Not a lot of people like to tie wet flies, or not a lot of people use wet flies anymore, which is really a shame because they are really, really good patterns to use and super effective on not only warm water species, but trout as well. And so I've included a few in this box as well. I also have 2 Tenkara flies. Now you may be thinking, you know, what can you even fish a Tenkara fly off of a fly rod? You know, does that even work? You know, what is this? And it's really just a reverse hackle fly. And I find that it is super effective on really picky fish in the winter as well. Good thing about it too is that it's, you know, it can also float on the surface. And so it could also be considered a dry fly. I like to fish it, you know, and pulse it in the water column, like a subsurface fly. So I have a few of those here in the box as well. They're kind of like my emergency, nothing's biting, you know, last resort. But honestly, I've caught a lot of fish on these flies, and definitely not something that's a requirement, just something that I've picked up that I really enjoy using. And so I've got, you know, a few of them in the box as well. Usually the flies that I use the most, I tie a good amount of, you know, from 5 to 6. Whereas the flies that I don't use so often, I just have 2, you know, 1 to use, 1 to lose. It's usually a good rule of thumb. So I've got a few Tenkara flies in here just for backup emergencies. So that wraps up the nymph portion of the box. And we're going to move on to the streamer section, which are honestly my most favorite flies to tie. I've got here a classic woolly bugger. You know, really that's all you got to say about it. Everyone knows it. Even if you're not even interested in fly fishing, you've probably heard of the woolly bugger before. It's probably the greatest fly of all time. I've got it here tied on a jig hook with a orange hotspot bead just because I like to tie mine that way, but there's really not much else to be said about this. I've also got here some Brushy Creek streamers, and that's tied by Chris Johnson, the owner of Living Waters Fly Fishing, and they are a few videos on his Vimeo, and then on the YouTube, he's got a YouTube video with GRTCU about how to tie this. It imitates a blacktail shiner, and it's a small bait fish and is very effective in low and clear water conditions like Brushy Creek. I've got 3 tied here, and I really like to use this pattern a lot. It's best tied skimpy. You know, don't use too much craft fur. It's also a very good beginner pattern and pretty good introduction to streamer fly tying. I've got it here not tied on a jig hook, just on a normal streamer hook and bead. But if you want to fish it a little deeper, I would tie it on a jigged hook. So next, I've got here the Pheasant Bugger Jig. Now, this is my crawfish imitation in the box. It's a pattern that I found from Gunnar Brammer. He's got a really good video about it. It's suggestive of a smallmouth fry, crayfish, you know, just a foraging bait fish basically. It's tied on a jig hook, and I really do like the pheasant portion of it. It's got a natural color tone to it. The pheasant tail here in the back imitates, you know, some antenna. It just syncs very well, and just a really awesome pattern. He's got a video of how to tie this as well that I'll also link in the description box, but it is something that you cannot leave home without. So that's going to wrap it up for today's video. thank you guys for watching if you've been watching this far. I hope you guys learned something, or maybe learned a new pattern that you could add to the box. Share any patterns with me in the comment section below of patterns that work well for you, and I'll catch you in the next one.